The king's secret. To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman. Not that he felt any romantic affection for her, far from it, but in all the cases that crossed his path, in all the minds he had outwitted, Irene Adler stood apart. Watson remembered it clearly. The spring of 1888. He had married and moved out of Baker Street, yet his visits to Holmes remained frequent. On one such evening, as he entered their old sitting room, he found Holmes lounging in his familiar dressing gown, eyes closed, pipe in hand. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said without opening his eyes. "You've gained 7 pounds since your marriage." Watson laughed. "How could you possibly? The cuffs of your trousers are tighter. Your gait is less energetic, obvious." Holmes sat up and gestured to the hearth. "Sit. You've arrived just in time. I'm expecting a visitor." "A client?" Holmes nodded. "A man of considerable importance, foreign, royal, and quite desperate." Just then, footsteps echoed on the stairs. A knock came. Mrs. Hudson opened the door, revealing a tall man in a dark cloak and mask. His bearing was regal, his tone urgent. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes nodded. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely." The masked man hesitated, then removed his disguise. "I am Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund von Ormstein," he said, "Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein and King of Bohemia." Watson blinked. "I have come," the king said, "because my honor, no, my future, is in danger." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on, Your Majesty." The king took a deep breath. "There is a woman, Irene Adler, once close to me. She has something I must retrieve before it reaches the hands of my enemies." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "This," he said quietly, "should be most interesting." A royal request. The King of Bohemia stood tall, but there was a crack in his voice, something rarely heard from royalty. Vulnerability. "Irene Adler," he said, "is an American, an opera singer, beautiful, clever, and once she was my lover." Holmes said nothing. He simply watched. The king continued. "5 years ago we were close, too close. I was young, reckless. She has a photograph, one of us together. If it were published, it would ruin my engagement to the Princess of Scandinavia." Watson frowned. "Surely, if she loved you, she wouldn't—" The king interrupted. "She is no longer in love, and I fear she may sell it. Or worse, use it." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "Have you attempted to recover it?" "I have. Bribery, persuasion, even theft. Nothing worked. She keeps it hidden. And now she plans to marry another." Holmes leaned back, his mind already working. "You wish me to retrieve this photograph?" "Yes, before she can release it. You must understand, this isn't just scandal. It is a threat to the crown." Watson couldn't help but glance at Holmes, whose eyes now gleamed with quiet anticipation. "Where is she now?" Holmes asked. "London, in a villa on Serpentine Avenue." Holmes stood. "Then we have no time to waste. I shall begin tonight." The king reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy purse. "Expenses, whatever you need, spare no cost." Holmes took it, but waved it aside. "This is not about money. This is about the challenge." As the king left, Holmes turned to Watson with a smile. "A royal scandal, a brilliant woman, and a secret worth a crown." He stepped to the window, looking out into the fog. "Irene Adler," he said quietly. "Let's see what you're hiding." Irene Adler. The next morning, Holmes was gone before dawn. When Watson arrived at Baker Street, he found Holmes already home, though he looked nothing like himself. Gone was the sharp suit and slicked back hair. In its place, a scruffy coat, muddied boots, and a red kerchief tied carelessly around his neck. His face was smudged with ash, his posture slouched. Watson blinked. "Holmes?" Holmes grinned. The benefits of being a working-class stableman. No one notices the help. He explained that he had spent the morning loitering near Serpentine Avenue, observing the comings and goings around Irene Adler's villa. "She leaves every afternoon at 5, Holmes said, for her regular drive and walk in the park, alone except for her coachman." "And inside the house?" Watson asked. "She lives simply, no obvious security, but I suspect the photograph is well hidden, perhaps behind a locked panel or fireplace." Holmes's eyes sparkled. "She's clever, Watson. Much too clever to leave it lying in a drawer." Watson raised an eyebrow. "And what now?" "Now," Holmes said, "I become a clergyman." He changed quickly into a black coat, added a false nose and sideburns, and grabbed a small Bible from the shelf. Watson watched in awe. "Tonight," Holmes said, "I intend to stage a small accident outside her home. You'll be nearby. When I give the signal, you'll cause a distraction. It must be convincing." Watson nodded. "What signal?" Holmes smiled. "I'll be crying out in pain." As the sun began to set, the plan was in motion. Holmes, in full disguise, approached Serpentine Avenue. Irene Adler's carriage arrived as expected. She stepped out, graceful, composed, stunning. For a moment, Holmes simply stared. "Remarkable," he whispered to himself, "truly remarkable." Then he crossed the street and the game began. A disguise and a plan. Dusk settled over Serpentine Avenue as Holmes positioned himself near the front steps of Irene Adler's villa. In his clergyman disguise, he looked like a kind aging man. Harmless, invisible. At precisely 5 o'clock, Irene's carriage returned. She stepped out gracefully, dressed in elegant walking clothes. The street lamps flickered as she turned toward her front door. That was Holmes's moment. He rushed forward. A group of rough-looking men, paid actors, approaching behind him. They shouted and shoved. "Make way, parson!" Holmes stumbled deliberately, fell to the pavement, and let out a cry of pain. Watson, watching from across the street, rushed forward on cue. "Stand back," he shouted. "The man's injured." The door of the villa burst open. Irene Adler herself appeared. "Help him inside," she ordered. Holmes, moaning theatrically, was carried into her sitting room. She knelt beside him, concerned. "Fetch water," she told a servant. Holmes peeked under his eyelids, taking in the layout of the room. The furniture, the mantel, the framed photos, the likely hiding places. Minutes passed. Then Holmes stood suddenly. "I feel better," he said, feigning confusion. "It must have been a dizzy spell." Irene smiled warmly. "I'm glad you're all right, Reverend." Holmes thanked her and left. Back on the street, he whispered to Watson, "Perfect, she's generous. And now she'll be cautious." Watson frowned. "Cautious?" Holmes grinned. "Tomorrow she'll check the photograph's hiding place to make sure it's safe. All I have to do is watch." Watson looked puzzled. "But how will you know where she hides it?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Simple, I'll make her reveal it, with fire." The house in Serpentine Avenue. The following day, just before sunset, Holmes donned another disguise, a casual passerby, complete with cap and walking cane. Watson joined him, this time as himself, to witness what Holmes called the final move of the match. They arrived again at Irene Adler's villa on Serpentine Avenue. The house was quiet. All the players were in place. Holmes turned to Watson. "You'll wait by the gate. When you see me raise my hand and shout, call out, 'Fire!' Loudly. Then wait for what happens next." Watson hesitated. "Are we really setting a fire?" Holmes smiled. "No, but fear is a remarkable motivator." At 5 o'clock, Irene's carriage returned. She stepped out, graceful as ever. Holmes approached as if by chance, striking up a conversation in his disguised voice. She smiled politely, until a group of men, again Holmes' hired actors, began a staged scuffle in the street. Holmes raised his hand and cried out. Watson shouted from the gate, "Fire! Fire! The house is on fire!" In a matter of seconds, panic erupted. Servants ran, neighbors emerged, and Irene Adler, as Holmes predicted, sprang into action. She rushed into the sitting room, pulled aside a painting, and revealed a hidden panel. From it, she drew out a photograph, framed, wrapped in velvet, and clutched it tightly to her chest. Satisfied the fire was false, she quickly replaced it and calmed the staff. Holmes and Watson slipped away unnoticed. Back at Baker Street, Holmes's face glowed with satisfaction. "She showed me everything," he said, "exactly where it's hidden." Watson leaned forward. "And now?" "Tomorrow morning," Holmes said, "we return with the king and claim the photograph." He smiled, but only faintly. "She's brilliant, Watson. Brilliant and dangerous." Fire and revelation. The next morning, the King of Bohemia arrived at 221B Baker Street. Dressed in regal attire, tall and proud, he carried himself like a man accustomed to control, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. "Is it done?" he asked. Holmes, already dressed for travel, picked up his hat. "Not yet, but it will be. This morning, we retrieved the photograph." Watson joined them, and together the three men departed for Serpentine Avenue. As they arrived at Irene Adler's villa, something felt different. The street was still, the blinds drawn. A woman's voice sang faintly through an open window, but no servants bustled about. Holmes knocked. A maid answered, blinking in surprise. "Miss Adler?" Holmes asked. "She's gone, sir," the maid replied. "Left last night, very sudden. Took a cab to the train station with her new husband." Holmes's face remained calm. "May we enter?" The maid allowed it. Inside, everything was neat. Too neat, the kind of neatness left behind when someone doesn't plan to return. Holmes went directly to the fireplace. With the king and Watson watching, he reached behind the panel Irene had revealed during the false fire alarm. There, just as he had seen, was a velvet-wrapped photograph. He opened it slowly. It was a portrait of Irene Adler alone, graceful, confident, her gaze direct. And tucked beside it, a letter. Holmes unfolded the paper and read aloud. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you did it well. Very well indeed. You made me show my hand, but I am not so unwise as to let myself be caught. I left England with the man I truly love. The photograph is safe, but no longer a threat. I keep it only to protect myself, not to harm the king. Asterisk. You once called me clever. I thank you for the compliment. But know this, I shall always think kindly of you. Yours truly, Irene Norton, née Adler." The king stared, speechless. "She is gone," Holmes said quietly, "and she has won." The photograph. The room was silent after Holmes finished reading the letter. The King of Bohemia sat heavily in a nearby chair, the velvet-wrapped photograph resting in his gloved hands. He looked down at the image, not with anger, but with a kind of bittersweet respect. "She was always different," he murmured, "strong, independent. I thought I could win her, but clearly—" Holmes interrupted gently. "She has chosen another. And more than that, she has chosen peace." Watson watched Holmes carefully. There was no trace of disappointment on his face, only admiration. The king stood and turned toward Holmes. You have done marvelously. I owe you everything." Holmes waved the praise away. "The case is over. There is no scandal. The photograph will never be used against you." The king opened his cloak and pulled out a small box. "I wish to give you this," he said. "An emerald ring from my private collection. A token of gratitude." Holmes looked at the jewel, then slowly shook his head. "Your Majesty, I ask for something else." The king blinked. "Anything." Holmes pointed to the photograph. "That, merely that. The photograph of Irene Adler." The king hesitated, then nodded. "So be it. You are a strange man, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not so strange, perhaps. Just sentimental in my own way." As the king left, Watson remained behind. "She fooled you," Watson said softly. Holmes nodded. "Yes, she used intelligence, not deception. Grace, not violence. She saw through me as if I were made of glass." He held the photograph in both hands, then carefully tucked it away in a drawer. "To me," he said, "she will always be the woman." Holmes defeated? Later that evening, the fire at 221B, Baker Street, crackled quietly. Outside, rain tapped gently on the window panes. Inside, the world had grown still, except for Holmes, who sat in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, deep in thought. Watson broke the silence. "You rarely lose." Holmes looked up. "True, but this was no loss, Watson. She didn't outwit me with force or trickery. She won with elegance. And he paused, almost smiling. "I admire that." Watson raised an eyebrow. "Do you regret anything?" Holmes shook his head. "Regret is for those who seek comfort in outcomes. I seek truth, and in truth, Irene Adler proved herself the most remarkable opponent I've ever faced." He rose from his chair and walked to his desk. Slowly, almost ceremonially, he pulled open the drawer and removed the photograph. Watson watched as Holmes studied the image once more. "She's gone," Watson said. "She's no threat to anyone now." Holmes nodded. "Which is why I keep this not as a trophy, but as a reminder." Watson frowned. "Of what?" "That even the sharpest mind," Holmes replied, "can be humbled by character." Holmes gently placed the photograph back into the drawer and closed it. "Tell me," Watson said, "if she were to walk through that door now, what would you say?" Holmes stared into the flames for a moment, then answered quietly, "Nothing. She would know." Watson realized then that for all of Holmes's cold reason and precise logic, there was still a part of him, small, carefully hidden, that was moved by mystery of a different kind. Not the mystery of crime, but the mystery of people. The woman's letter. The next morning, Watson returned to Baker Street and found Holmes already at his desk, carefully rereading something. A single sheet of fine stationery lay before him, the letter Irene Adler had left behind. Watson approached quietly. "You're still thinking about her." Holmes didn't look up. Not thinking, remembering. He tapped the letter once, gently. "This," he said, "is not merely a farewell. It's a testament. A declaration of wit, independence, and intention." Watson read it again. "I remain, dear Mr. Holmes, yours respectfully, Irene Norton, née Adler." A single line, but it spoke volumes. She never meant harm, Holmes said. She wanted only security, dignity, and she achieved it, without a single act of violence. Watson sat beside him. "I must admit," he said, "I never expected you to speak of someone with such regard." Holmes allowed himself the barest smile. "She is the exception, the rare mind that thinks not just ahead but around. She saw through every one of my disguises, yet played along until the moment she was ready to disappear. Watson leaned back in his chair. It's strange, isn't it, that the case we thought would end in scandal ends in admiration. Holmes nodded. Because scandal depends on exposure, and she chose privacy. He opened a small drawer and placed the letter inside and beside the photograph. That will be the last I speak of her, he said quietly, but she will not be forgotten. Watson could feel it. This was more than a solved case. It was a story Holmes would carry with him, not as a lesson in failure, but as a reminder of the one woman who played the game and walked away victorious. A royal goodbye. 2 days later, the King of Bohemia returned to Baker Street. He arrived in full ceremonial attire, medals gleaming, cloak draped with precision, the air of royal pride restored. And yet, there was still something uncertain in his step. Holmes greeted him without formality. "You've heard, I assume," Holmes said. The king nodded. "She is married, gone, vanished without a trace. No scandal, no betrayal. Simply gone." Holmes gestured to a chair. "You should be relieved, Your Majesty. The threat is over." The king exhaled slowly. "I should be, and yet she haunts me." Watson observed quietly from the corner, watching the struggle within the monarch's face. "I loved her," the king admitted. "I would have made her a queen." Holmes, seated across from him, tilted his head slightly. "She would not have accepted it." The king looked up, surprised. "She valued freedom more than power," Holmes continued. "She chose a simpler life, one where she answered to no one, not even a king." The silence that followed was heavy, not with regret, but with understanding. The king stood and reached once more into his cloak. "The emerald ring, Mr. Holmes. Please, accept it now." Holmes raised a hand. "No, Your Majesty. My price was the truth. I have it." The king smiled faintly. "Then I shall keep this ring, to remind me that there are things even a king cannot possess." He turned to leave, pausing only once at the door. "Is there any title you would have me bestow upon her?" Holmes replied without hesitation. "Tell your people she is simply the woman." And with that, the king was gone. Irene's escape. Spring turned to summer in London, and life moved on. Yet for Holmes, something lingered. He never spoke her name again, but every now and then, when an opera aria floated through an open window, or when the scent of lavender drifted into the room, Watson noticed his friend's gaze drift, just for a moment. Irene Adler had vanished from public life. The newspapers reported her departure from England, her marriage to a barrister from God knows where, and then nothing. No scandal, no photograph, no trace. She had done what no criminal, no noble, no mastermind had ever done. She had beaten Sherlock Holmes, but it wasn't the defeat that remained with him. It was how she had done it. No trickery, no violence, no vengeance, just brilliance, grace, and timing. "Oh," Watson once asked him, gently, cautiously, if he wished he'd handled it differently. Holmes only replied, "I played my best game. She played hers better." There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet respect. Sometimes, late at night, Holmes would sit by the fire with his violin. He'd play slow, mournful notes, not like his usual sharp bursts of energy, but melodies filled with reflection. And Watson would listen, knowing the music wasn't for an audience. It was for her, a salute perhaps, to a worthy opponent, to the only woman who had ever truly surprised him, to the woman, the mind of Sherlock Holmes. As Watson penned the final lines of the case, he paused to glance at Holmes, who sat in his chair, silent, still, unreadable. The case of Irene Adler had left no arrests, no court trial, no recovered evidence, only a vanished photograph and a memory that refused to fade. And yet, it lingered more powerfully than any headline ever could. Watson closed his notebook and reflected. Sherlock Holmes prided himself on logic, precision, detachment. But in this case, he had encountered something he could neither predict nor control: the elegant unpredictability of human nature. And in Irene Adler, he found a reflection of the very thing he rarely acknowledged: emotion paired with intellect. Watson recalled Holmes's words, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data." But Irene had taught him something more. Sometimes the data doesn't lie in smoke and ash or footprints and fibers. Sometimes it lies in people. She had won not because she was faster or stronger, but because she had understood Holmes just as he had sought to understand her. Watson tucked his notes away. He would publish the story one day, but he would change names, soften details. Because this wasn't just a case file. It was a memory, a reminder that even the greatest mind in London could be caught off guard, not by crime, but by character. And so she remained, not just in Holmes's drawer, hidden behind a velvet frame, but in his silence, in his music, in the rare moments when he spoke with warmth. To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman.